Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching this LTC, and it has been quite a year for Warcry. It is December. I know it's a little early in December, but we are doing our year in review because there's been more releases, more awesome stuff for Warcry than you can shake a stick at least more than I can possibly go back and remember. All of it's been really incredible. We could cover every single Underworlds warband that's gotten Warcry rules. We could cover all of the incredible Warcry warbands that have come out in 2023. We've just seen more than we've ever seen before for this game, and it's truly wonderful and amazing. But there's really just one thing that I really truly care about here. One thing that I will always remember this year for, and that is dwarves. Let's go back to where it all started. The January FAQ at the beginning of the year kicked off the Year of the Dwarf in earnest. It was essentially written as if someone had just taken a page out of the Book of Grudges and just pasted it into the FAQ. It was incredible. It had nerfs to everything that wasn't a dwarf. To go a little bit even further back in time, dwarves were truly terrible in most of 1.0. Fyreslayers were considered the worst faction in the game. Even KO were just like pub stomp only. They couldn't hold up in competitive play at all. And 2.0 really helped them out. It solved a lot of the issues that a lot of Move 3 fighters had in 1.0. It made Move 3 very good and generally undercosted. But there were still other things at the outset that were much more powerful than dwarves. The first was Soulblight and their resurrections. Soulblight also have lots of Move 3 fighters in Skeletons and Graveguards, but what they could do was once you killed a few of them, they could resurrect their Graveguards, and they could do it into combat with you and have their Graveguards still be able to attack that round. So they could just wait until the end of the round. Whoever you had who was vulnerable, they would just resurrect a Graveguard on it, and then the Graveguard would kill it, and that would be their last action in the round. It was completely broken. Now, of course, that resurrection nerf, they made it so that you couldn't do that, which really hurt Nighthaunt because they were relying on that to be like just an average warband, and so when they lost it, they became pretty bad. But it absolutely took Soulblight down a peg. Monsters were the other thing that was completely broken. Monsters were just able to walk around the board, dragon mauling everything, and they all went up about 100 points, which meant that most factions couldn't run a monster and also support its flanks. And so it just became much easier to take monsters out of the game or just focus your whole warband on the monster and bring it down and then not have to deal with much else afterwards. Only a few factions can really run monsters effectively now. The reason being you need to be able to get enough numbers and enough staying power onto the board to keep sort of protecting your monster the whole game. And it's really only Nurgle and dwarves that are able to do it. Dwarves can still use monsters. The only one they have access to is the Charybdis, but they're still very good with the Charybdis. And so this sort of huge nerf for monsters, it was kind of just a buff for dwarves. Lead from the back was also eliminated, and lead from the back, other than Dragon Maul, was probably one of the best triples in the game. I don't think it actually warranted being nerfed as hard as it was, but it did happen. So lead from the back allowed Skaven leaders to project a +3 attack bubble around themselves, which was just an incredible offensive engine for Chaos. Chaos, had certain factions with profiles that really benefited from this a lot, specifically Iron Golems. Khorne was really good with this. They had a few factions that could really put their damage through the roof if they had a Skaven leader as an ally, but that's not happening anymore. And so those factions can no longer clear all that dwarven beef off of the board, and so a huge win for dwarves. It also left Fight for Profit and Swift as the Wind as essentially the two best triples remaining in the game. Swift as the Wind, of course, is the same as Wah from Ironjaws and another one that Flesh Eater Courts has, but it's especially good for dwarves because they only have that move 3. and they don't have a lot of other movement shenanigans. And it was nerfed from being just the value of the dice, so up to 6 inches of additional move, to just half the value, so 3 inches. But half the value is still really good and still made it one of the best abilities in the game. And of course, dwarves use it really well. Fight for Profit can give +1 attack bubble, but if the user is on an objective or carrying treasure, it becomes a +2 attack bubble. And the catch with Fight for Profit, that of course makes it better than the other similar abilities, is that it works for ranged attacks, which is wonderful for dwarves because a lot of dwarves have artillery, which is amazing for them. So the January FAQ just rearranged the landscape of 2nd edition so that dwarves would be on top. And boy, did they take advantage by just hanging banner after banner after banner. This is a table of all of the championships that were won this year at tournaments. I have championship equivalents, so these are undefeated records. And as you can see, Kharadron Overlords, of course, leading the way with an astounding 11 championships, but all the other dwarves chipped in too. Cities of Sigmar won 4 tournaments, Fyreslayers won a tournament, Vulkyn Flameseekers, the new kids on the block, even they won a tournament. It was incredible. Dwarves won 17 championships in only 68 attempts. That is absurd. Stormcast won 12, but in way more attempts, just in general. So I'm really blown away by the success of dwarves in all of these tournaments across the history of this year. These are only since the FAQ, of course, these tournaments. Before that, I threw out that data. But it just shows you just how much they dominated. So short bodies with long hammers, indeed. They thrived in every single type of pack. I think a lot of people for a while thought that they would only be able to win in the Rumble pack where it's all objective missions. However, in kill missions, when you have dwarves and then a few really smashy allies, what happens is your dwarves are just really stubborn and really tougher to kill for the other person's smashy fighters. And so they are slower at killing your stuff than you are at killing them, or you hold them up and then your smashy guys get to attack their smashy people while their smashy people are still busy fighting your dwarves. Lots of powerful things you can do with that. Lots of configurations of different lists, different approaches to lists that are all just powerful due to that incredible dwarven stubbornness of having 12 wounds and being very cheap. We can ignore these absurd Nurgle numbers. Nurgles are sort of honorary dwarves in a way, but probably worth their own video talking about Nurgle and the absurd success rate that it has had. I also wish that we could count those 2 Horns of Hashut numbers. They certainly wish that they could count. Horns of Hashut are just a bunch of dwarven wannabes, but those don't count because there's no actual dwarves in that faction. Either way, though, it is incredibly impressive what dwarves have done this year. So let's just take a look at all of them and what's been so good for them. Kharadron Overlords are the big ones, of course, leading the charge. The things that have worked, and all of them still do. Number 1 is Aether Cannon combos. The Aether Cannon is a dwarven artillery piece, 110 points for a dwarf holding a cannon that only rolls 1 dice, but it's got high strength and deals 5-10 damage on hits and crits. What's amazing for that is, of course, the combo with Fight for Profit is you can give it +2 dice. All of a sudden, you get to roll 6 dice when you're attacking twice. Your ability to clear fighters off the board in 1 round of shooting that costs the same amount as your shooter does is absurd and completely broken. They're able to just... the points investment that you spend on the Aether Cannons versus what they will clear off the board is completely overwhelming and kind of silly. And so you can you can count on those to be very, very difficult for almost any warband to beat. The other thing that's incredible that KO are very, very good at, that they have had success with, is Arcanaut spam with big allies. This is essentially running KO as if it's Nurgle. Now, your ally choice isn't quite as strong as Chaos's ally choices, but in my opinion, Arcanauts are a little bit better than Plague Bearers, so I think it evens out. You essentially have one big fast ally, one slowish ally, and then at least 6 Arcanauts. You're probably going to have another, like one of the fightier KO melee heroes, and you're just going to swarm that board with these little Arcanauts, get them into position, and then just start pew pew lasering everything that's around you, so that all the Arcanauts can be focus firing the same thing every single turn, which actually makes their offense pretty reasonable. The cool thing about KO is that both of these approaches work if you just go all in on them, but also mixes in between, combinations in between also works pretty well. You can use your deployment groups to kind of make one deployment group playing one of these types of games and the other deployment group playing another game, right? You can have an Aether Cannon and a leader, but just one in one deployment group, and then the rest of them are just like Arcanauts and allies, and that's it. And that's really powerful too. You see all sorts of combinations in between, and it's so cool. Beyond that, they actually have some sneakily underrated stuff too. One thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about with KO until they've either played with them or against a strong pilot running them is how good some of their leaders are in melee. I think generally you want to be playing one of the really good KO leaders in melee. There's one for 140 points and one for 145 that are both really excellent in melee. They're so good at punishing opponents who rush down your cannons. So if your opponent just like throws everything into just closing with the cannons, all of a sudden your leader just gets to have 2 attacks unencumbered and just really really make them wish they had thought about their choices in life a little bit more heavily. Also, the Gruntstock Mortar is very good and very underrated. You can run it in a deployment group that doesn't have a leader, and it'll still be incredibly points efficient. It has a little bit more range than the Aether Cannon, which is nice. Now, it does have a big donut. You can't attack anything within 6 inches of you, so you really have to stay in the back there. So it can be a little bit difficult in like objective missions where, you know, you do have to walk forward to an objective. Sometimes you need to be shooting someone where you're clipping the back of the objective and they're clipping the front of it, and so they're about like 4.5 inches away from you. That's a situation where Aether Cannons can shoot, but these mortars can't. But you can almost always find a really effective spot for a mortar in your list, and the fact that they don't need a leader next to them in order to do their thing is really powerful. Finally, spears. We didn't see anyone trying this really all year, and the reason is spears only come 1 to a box, and when you have a bunch of Arcanauts and you buy a box of them, why would you buy 3 more boxes to get a whole bunch of spears when the flood of Arcanauts that you get in one box is perfectly good anyway? So people haven't been trying this, but all melee KO does exist. It is probably pretty good because those spears do an incredible amount of damage for only 75 points, and they've got the little range 2, which is really nice on 3-inch move models. They are very, very good, and I hope to one day see someone try it out because I think it would be pretty effective. My favorite KO list I've seen was the 3-0 list from Warcry, which is a Norwegian tournament in Q4 of 2023. This is actually very recent. This is only about 3 weeks ago. It has an Endrin Master, which is one of the really scary melee leaders. That Endrin Master is only 140 points, but it hits like a 200-point model. It's really, truly incredible. Now, it's very slow, but the incredible skill of KO is essentially they make you come to them. And so, of course, having a slow melee leader is still fine. They also had a ferocious Bloodrack Medusa, 2 mighty Aether Cannons. That is the Divine Blessing that gives you +1 strength. And then 6 Arcanauts. Arcanauts are, of course, amazing, and I like any list that's running a whole bunch of them. The cool things about this, right? What's scarier than an Aether Cannon? An Aether Cannon that can actually threaten Stormcast? That is ridiculous, right? When your 110-point model is putting real fear into their 200-point leaders, that is going to be a problem for them. And I think that this player probably ran this because Stormcast are a little bit on the more popular side in Norway, and there are some of the sort of competent pilots who, for example, when I talked about Stormcast having a lot of championships despite having a negative win rate, it's because Stormcast in the hands of a master is a completely different proposition than Stormcast in the hands of, maybe someone who didn't tune them up fully and maybe isn't totally focusing on their games as much. It's just a completely different proposition. And so I'm wondering if this pilot maybe focused on the extra strength for their Aether Cannons because they were worried about a Stormcast meta. And it was clearly effective for them. I don't actually know who they played, but they won all 3 of their games. The ferocious Bloodrack Medusa is so cool, where the Bloodrack, of course, has that net that works 88% of the time. According to the pilot, it only worked 50% of the time in the tournament, but that's okay because the threat of the Bloodrack is pretty incredible because of her ability to lock something down. And then with her 2-inch range and pretty reasonable attack profile that this person just decided to make even more reasonable, she's able to just kind of stab at the thing that she's locking down while she's locking it down, which is really, really cool. And so having the scariest thing on the board be a netter gives you a lot of options. It's funny, the Centaurian Marshal for Chaos is 295 points, but the net is only a standard net. It only works 2/3 of the time. And, the damage output is not quite as impressive as you want. And it has the Mount Rune Mark and an absolutely ginormous base that's hard to move around the battlefield. The Bloodrack Medusa with the Ferocious Blessing essentially does everything the Centaurian Marshal wishes it could do, but the Bloodrack actually does it, which is just really powerful. Having your big thing be able to just say, I'm going to lock down your big thing and then either kill your little friends or just start winning the fight against you is just really, really strong. And so this is definitely my favorite KO list that I've seen. This is the one that I'd probably be most concerned about if I was testing. The one thing is, if I was playing it into a meta where I didn't expect a lot of Stormcast, I'd probably drop those 2 Mighty Blessings on the Aether Cannons. Maybe even drop the Ferocious Blessing on the Bloodrack Medusa to get another Arcanaut in there. That'd be pretty good and pretty wild having all those numbers. But I think for the meta that this person was sort of thinking that they would have to play into, their name is Christian, by the way. Well done, Christian. The meta that they were thinking that they were going to have to play into, I think this is an incredible configuration and I love it. So how I would do KO personally, I know I just said that you should be most afraid of this, but I would really only go with 1 Aether Cannon. I'm a big fan of I play a lot of Nurgle, as many people know. So I'm a big fan of having 1 fast threat and 1 slow threat and sort of getting the power combination of the 2 of those. So I would go with an Admiral, an Achillean King, a Decimator Prime, 1 Aether Cannon, and then 5 Arcanaut Company. You're a little bit lighter on numbers than you could be with KO, but it's an incredibly powerful setup. I think Achillean Kings are just incredible. And then Decimator Primes are just really solid for their ability to actually run around the board because they've got a little a double there that gives them a free move if any of their friends are injured. So you have a lot of options here. And that's just how I would personally do it. That said, this list is awesome. And I think, this, I haven't actually gone and done this at all, but this one is truly incredible. KO's Outlook. Now, we know from a recent sort of set of updates, essentially they gave us all new profiles for everything in Cities of Sigmar. We know that they are mulling a different points algorithm that is a little bit less friendly to cheap move 3 fighters, but they kept all of the heroes of Dispossessed, so Cities of Sigmar dwarves. They kept all the heroes around the same points cost. Some of them even went down, but a lot of the cheap troops went up a little bit. So it's looking like we will probably see a nerf to Arcanauts. Maybe not, in the next month, but probably in the next little while, we'll eventually see a nerf to Arcanauts. The wild thing is, yes, cheap move 3 fighters are too strong in Warcry at the moment, but so are every single thing in the game with either a 5/10 or a 4/8 damage profile. Every single fighter with a 510 or 48 profile is just like a little bit undercosted. And so those all need a nerf, but I don't think GW knows about that as much. The reason being the best fighters with 510 and 48 profiles tend not to win a ton of games in their own faction. They tend to travel from faction to faction, right? So if you just track faction win rates, you don't necessarily understand the incredible impact that Gut Lords have on games, or that FOMO crushers have on games. And so I don't know that GW knows that those things need a nerf. And the reason that this is relevant is because in the new Cities of Sigmar updates that we recently got, most ranged units got buffed, and the Dwarven troop ranged units escaped the really hard nerfs that other Dwarven troops got. They mostly, if they were nerfed by a lot fewer points than the other Dwarven melee units were. And so I think that that's really telling, in that in a points update, Aether Cannons might stay the same. Even if they do get nerfed, I would expect the other KO artillery pieces to essentially come down in points a little bit to make up for it. So there might be a bit of a switch in Kharadron Overlords from one big cannon to a gun line. As long as KO still has Fight for Profit as an ability, they'll be able to weather that just fine. I really hope Fight for Profit doesn't get nerfed, not because it's reasonable right now, but because it's actually an incredibly cool ability. It is everything that KO is about, as far as like hyper capitalistic weird dwarves, because being next to the objective or having treasure means that they're just like going for their personal rewards. It tells their story in just such a simple ability. And so something has to be the best, and I just think that the best abilities in the game should also be some of the coolest abilities in the game. And I think that Fight for Profit absolutely sort of checks that box. And so having it as the best triple in the game is perfectly fine. I think you can actually debate really whether it's the best triple in the game, but it's certainly up there in that top tier of them. And so I hope that the ability stays there, even if maybe the points go up on a few KO things. So I would expect to, maybe if you bought a box of Thunderers and you've only been using your Aether Cannon, I would expect that maybe a set of balance updates to the game makes it so that you end up wanting to dust off some of the other Thunderers from that box instead of only the cannon. But who knows? We will find out eventually. Next, it's time to get to Cities of Sigmar, and they have been defined by Swift as the Wind, their ability. It has been absolutely dominant while it lasted. It unfortunately no longer exists because Cities of Sigmar was reworked. Tempest's Eye no longer exists as a subfaction. Dispossessed are on their own, but it just ruled the game for a while, and so any year in review would be incomplete without talking about it. Old Guards were probably the number 2 definitive ally in the game behind Brugits for the whole year. All sorts of games were won with warbands that were only running one dwarf, but that dwarf was a Tempest's Eye hero. I actually personally won a tournament with a single dwarf in my list, and that was a Tempest's Eye Old Guard. So I am a part of that little movement there. So even though they won a whole bunch of tournaments as allies, they also won 4 tournaments on their own. And part of the reason for that is Cities of Sigmar is just so definitively good at having these 12 wound little melee guys. And you have multiple different flavors to work with, which is really cool. You got to have Iron Breakers for waves of toughness 5 counterbots. For only 60 points, you could just just trundle these guys all around the field, and nobody could kill them. So you would just always know that most of your horde was still going to be there at the end, and your opponent was going to have a bad time with that. Otherwise, though, you could shift into Longbeards or Hammerers, and yes, they were a little bit more points, but you could have a swarm warband that could actually kill your opponent. And that can be really crazy. It can really upend some of the calculus that people make. So, for example, a lot of people expect that kill missions are going to favor elite warbands with only a few high impact fighters, and objective missions are going to favor swarm warbands with lots of low impact fighters who just sort of score more points. That is sort of a perfectly fine rule of thumb for most people to use, and I would absolutely still give that advice to new players to just like as their set of assumptions to start with. But these really killy swarms like Longbeards, Graveguard do this too. These really killy swarms can kind of flip that on its head, where they can actually kill elite units point for point, and have the fact that, they bracket down each time one of them dies. They can have that not matter that much because, they've got these 12 wounds. A lot of the time they'll survive the first attack, and then they'll just put a ton of damage on over time, which is really, really powerful. So it was really cool. People won tournaments with both approaches. People did really well in tournaments with both approaches. It was all just wonderful. Now, I'm not going to give Cities of Sigmar lists out because, unfortunately, this was canceled. GW looked at the incredible power of Tempest Eye and said, no more, we've had enough. We are reworking it to Dispossessed. Now, there hasn't been enough time for people to take a lot of Dispossessed stuff to tournaments, but they have a lot to work with. And so there's a lot to look forward to in 2024 with Dispossessed. They're already on the new algorithm, the new points algorithm that GW is mulling over. So you don't have to worry that your pieces are going to potentially get nerfed. And you get to do a lot of stuff. They have an incredible reaction called Grudge Bearers. A fighter can make this reaction when they are targeted by a melee attack action after the damage is totaled, but before it's allocated to this fighter. If it's enough for the fighter to be taken down, pick another friendly fighter. That fighter makes a bonus move action or a bonus attack action. So one, this is cool because you don't have to use it until you know if you're going to be taken down or not. It does have a little bit of difficult sort of tension with counter, because you do have to decide, if I'm going to counter, I need to counter before they attack. And then if you give up counter, that's when you can do Grudge Bearers. But you could have a situation where you don't counter and then they don't quite kill you. And this is a good spot to be in. This is a good problem to have, but you give up like 2 or 3 damage that way. So that is a little bit of tension, but for the most part, it's amazing because you can just give free actions to your highest impact fighters, and there's no range requirement. So you can just pick something all the way across the board and say, here, you have an action or a bonus attack action. So that's really awesome. They also have total dominance around objectives. First, they have Over My Dead Body, so any dwarf can just use a double to say, now I count for 2 additional fighters while determining sort of who controls an objective. And you also get to subtract damage points from hit and crit for anyone, within 3 inches of a fighter when they're using a double, which means that it can be almost impossible to clear a horde of dwarves off of an objective, something like that, which is just really powerful for those little mini team fights that happen around objectives. So with all of that to work with, they're in a great spot. And so if I were going to sort of build around their strengths, I would want to start with sort of proactive, durable threats. So things like Stormcast heroes, or potentially a monster, right? Because monsters have sort of the highest possible impact, but they can bracket over time. Luckily, the Charybdis really doesn't start to fall off until it's been double bracketed, and even then it's still pretty scary. So really they want to do 31 damage to it before it becomes like a really not useful thing to give free actions to. So it gives you a lot of power. In my opinion, both sort of ways are equally powerful. You can either run a Charybdis with a whole bunch of little dwarves, or you could just run 2, like a decimator and an annihilator and something like that, and just give only bonus actions to your 2 Stormcast heroes. And they're going to be a little bit more durable because they don't necessarily bracket over time. It's really hard to put a bunch of damage onto them because they're all toughness 6, right, which is pretty incredible. But they don't sort of have Dragon Maul, which is just an absurd ability. And you can get to that point in Dispossessed where, you can just always shoot for a triple and a double each round, and then you sort of super count on one objective while also getting to Dragon Maul something, and that can give you a ton of like absurd ability utility that your opponents don't get to get. The one thing that you're going to want to pair with those proactive durable threats is just going to be enough bodies to get your reaction. So a couple different things you can do here. One is you can just play a lot of dwarves, or you can play a couple scary dwarves and give them the Spiteful Blessing. So now your opponent really wants to kill them, and you have Spiteful Blessing so that you can, once it does die, even if it's already activated, you can just give that action over. I actually think a Spiteful Dispossessed hero is a really intriguing ally for a lot of teams because you can get onto an objective, use a double, count for 2 additional fighters, and then you get to react when they have to kill you because you're counting for 3 on the objective. And then once they do, you use your guaranteed reaction to then give your best fighter, a free attack, something like that. So I think that's a pretty powerful ally. But in general, for just playing in Dispossessed, I think you want to have a lot of fighters, which means that previously, you could really justify Ironbreakers, Longbeards, or Hammerers as the backbone of your warband. Now, based on like what Dispossessed are good at, I would lean towards more Ironbreakers than going for Hammerers or Longbeards. Previously, I would have leaned more Longbeards, but that's how I'd go for it. So let's get into Fyreslayers now, which are the sort of most loved and most hated of the dwarf factions. Of course, lots of people will tell you Fyreslayers all look the same. I certainly have had that problem not being able to tell them apart, but they've got a lot of personality. Each individual Fyreslayer has a lot of personality, even if their personalities aren't different from each other. The things that worked for Fyreslayers are the main thing being that they have 2 different flavors of really excellent chaff. Now, they were a little bit less efficient than Cities of Sigmar, but they're close enough that you don't mind. They're paying for this charge triple, so the Vulkite Berserker with Fire Steel Weapon and Bladed Sling Shield has that wonderful combination of cheap points cost, toughness 5, 12 wounds, very difficult to clear off the board. These can, if they end a move action near you, they just bash you with their shield and do damage to you for a triple. That's pretty powerful. The other option, of course, is the really fighty version that has 4-4-1-3, which is really good output for a 70-point fighter. And so if you're not quite as concerned about, keeping them on the board, you can do a ton of damage with these Vulkite Berserkers with 2 weapons. And so you really get 2 options with Fyreslayers, and that's really cool. The other thing that's been awesome for Fyreslayers, and has probably been what has brought their win rate down so much and actually stopped them from winning tournaments, but we love them for it anyway. Mechanically, they are very lovable because they have so many fun build-arounds. They have Duty Unto Death, which essentially gives you a rampage for a triple if you've taken 5 damage. That's for Hearthguards and their Carls, which is pretty powerful. They also have a lot of different burn spells. So, for example, Molten Rock is an ability that the sort of Auric Hearthguards can use, where if they shoot you, even if they miss, you get covered in Molten Rock and your movement goes way down, so they can turn, a 4-inch move fighter into move 1, something like that, which is completely absurd. They have Volcano's Call, which is a good burn spell. They all have a really terrible burn spell called Throwing Axe, but it's basically just, I'm desperate, I'll roll a double, maybe I get a crit, and if I do a ton of damage, which is cool. They also have like tons of auras. It feels like all of them have Honor Our Oaths, which is the basic aura that if they get a kill, they get to give everybody +1 attack, which is really nice. That's actually really excellent with the toughness 5 ones because those are on 2 attacks, but The profile itself, strength 4, 1, 4, is actually really reasonable. So if you get a kill near all of your little shield dwarves, all of a sudden, all of your chaff that you've been holding, right? You attacked with your leader first because, it's the highest impact, and then also you want your chaff being able to use counter as a reaction. So you do that, and now all of a sudden these chaff that haven't activated yet because you've been holding them back for counter, all of a sudden they are actual threats now, which is really powerful. So that Honor Our Oaths synergy is really nice, but they also have Flame Keepers, which if there's a kill, they can give you +1/+1 damage. You also have Rune Fathers, which have an aura ability. You just have so many different auras and aura abilities. Most of them are not that powerful, but they're all really fun to play because, like the shifting and putting everyone in the right spots is really fun in Warcry in a way that it's not that fun in AOS because of the way that units work, and you have to like weirdly massage the base of a unit, which is the combination of all these bases. But in Warcry, all of those sort of auras are just much more fun to kind of project around the board because you only have to deal with one fighter at a time with it, which is really fun. Now, the thing that was most powerful with Fyreslayers was to have a Tempest-Eye ally and to get that move buff to accelerate them around the board. They were one of the biggest losers from the sort of Tempest-Eye change, other than, of course, Dispossessed. Losing actual Tempest-Eye was certainly the biggest loser, but the second biggest loser was definitely Fyreslayers. They lost the move buff, which they needed because their own native move buff is not very good, and they don't have the incredible artillery that KO has. But there are still things they can do. Calthea exists if you don't mind a Stormcast ally. Kixitaka exists if you don't mind a Seraphon ally. Maybe sort of paint the lizards red so that they look a little bit like magma droths. I don't know. There's also just fast allies you can use. You can use lots of Daughters of Cain allies, things like that, to get a little bit of speed. There are workarounds, but it is just overall significantly less powerful. But still very, very doable. You just have to be a little more careful with how you do things. The way I would do it, I've got two here. Because Fyreslayers are so sort of geared towards playing a little bit goofy, someone actually made a really helpful comment once on one of my videos when I talked about how Fyreslayers are one of the strongest factions in the game, but their win rate is not very high, and people just tend to play sort of weaker, untuned lists with them. And they said that it's because nobody buys Fyreslayers wanting to play a really cynical, like swarm counter control warband. People buy Fyreslayers because they want to play with little Gotreks. And so you want to do the really smashy ones, which are the Hearthguards, which don't suck, but they're not as overwhelmingly powerful. And so you just tend to see less focused lists with them. Also because they have so many things that aren't quite traps, but are just not super competitively powerful. And so it's really tempting to play those. And so if I were getting really goofy and going all in on a meme with Fyreslayers, I would have a Spiteful Auric Flamekeeper. This is the one that whenever an ally dies, you get to give +1 damage to +1 damage and +1 crit to all of your buddies within 6 inches. I would have 4 Hand Axe Volkites. These are the really killy ones with 4 attacks, 4 strength, and if you are getting them in the buff zone, they are at 2 and 4 damage, which becomes you're getting the 4/4/2/4 profile for only 70 points. It's absolutely absurd how you're able to do that. And so I would run 4 of those, 2 shield ones just to have a little bit of toughness. You put the shields in front. The thing that's really powerful, not every opponent will allow you to do this, especially opponents with a little bit of speed. And, the more experienced the opponent, the harder it's going to be to set this up. But if you can accelerate the shield Volkites into their face, make them work really hard to kill the shielded ones, and then you get to go spiteful, use your reaction to accelerate your hand axes. That's an incredibly broken thing you can do if you pull it off. Then I would have a Gorgai. The Gorgai is the Daughters of Cain hero that just has a lot of attacks, not a lot of extra utility, but just lots of attacks, and just move 7 to give you a little bit of speed you're missing, and just a really solid heavy hitter who's not too expensive, who becomes much better when under the influence of the Auric Flamekeeper. And then finally, I would have 2 Hearthguard Berserkers with Broadaxes. These are the ones that do 2/4 damage, but they have strength 5. So now your odds of hitting and actually proccing that extra damage from the Flamekeeper are really high. So every single fighter in here is sort of built to be extra good when around the Flamekeeper. Yes, there's only one Flamekeeper. They won't all be benefiting at the same time, but none of these fighters suck. So none of these fighters are terrible when they're not under the Flamekeeper. Maybe they're not the most competitive choices you can get to, but they're all reasonable. And then once you have the Flamekeeper buff on, you get to do a lot with them, which is pretty cool. If I were actually trying to compete with Fyreslayers, there's a few different directions you could go in. So my first draft would be to have a little bit of everything to really understand what's good in them and really sort of figure out which piece I wanted to lean more into. I would start with a Hearthguard Carl with Broadaxe. This is the one where if it takes 5 damage, you get to use a Rampage for free. Doomseekers are also very good. I like those too. But I would start with the Hearthguard Carl. Then I would go with a Bloodrack Medusa. For all the reasons we talked about in the KO video, just having a scary thing on the board that can also be a netter is really powerful. Then I would go with 3 Shield Volkites, because having those toughness 5, 12 wound fighters is just so powerful and has been sort of one of the backbones of Dwarven power for the entire year. Then I would have 1 Hand Axe Volkite, just to the points work out that way, and just to have a threat in a separate deployment group. I'd have an Auric Hearthguard. This is the one that if it attacks you, it can use a double to just like absolutely reduce your move by 1,000,000. And then I'd have Kixitaka to shuttle these dwarves around the board, and Odapoddle to be a little shooter who's also pretty fast. This is the first draft because it's going in 2 different directions. One direction is a pure control list with the toughness 5, the Auric Hearthguard, sort of reducing their movement, and then the Bloodrack Medusa netting them. So this is a very controlling, very sort of interact with your opponent in ways that they won't like, that isn't necessarily just damage sort of list. It can be very powerful. But the other thing that's kind of going on here is Kixitaka and Odapoddle sort of accelerating your dwarves around the board. I think that that's nice to have with dwarves regardless, and I'd maybe even consider having Kixitaka and Hearthguard Carl in the same deployment group. But you might find that with Kixitaka you want to have more of your more powerful dwarves, more maybe Hearthguard Berserkers, things like that. I think there's a lot to kind of experiment with. You could also try to do sort of a Calthea Zandire combo list, something like that. But there's still a lot to love, even without Tempest Eye, and this is what I would start with so that I could play a little bit of all of the competitive outlets that you can do to see which ones are most effective on the board, which ones are most effective in which types of missions, etc. Finally, we got a brand new dwarf faction this year, which is amazing. Now, yes, these are just more Fyreslayers, but they're better Fyreslayers. They're cooler Fyreslayers. They have better hair and actual pants, even though those pants are kilts, and not all of them have the pants. Basically, Dragon Hat Man does not have pants. But everyone else has these cool little kilts, and it makes it so that you can actually tell them apart a lot more easily than you can with Fyreslayers, which is awesome. So they're amazing. They have really cool specialist abilities. They have movement shenanigans with their little whippy guy who has eggs on his shoulders for some reason. It's a terrible place to store your eggs. Don't do that. But that's what he does. Then they've got good damage abilities, especially coming out of the Dragon Hat guy, which is really wonderful. It's wonderful to see quality specialists in these sort of bespoke warbands, because that has been the issue with bespoke warbands for their entirety of their existence, is that they've got lots of little mid-range fighters that don't have great combat stats and don't do anything because their abilities aren't interesting. They basically fixed that with this last release, where Flameseekers have interesting enough abilities that you don't mind how mid-rangey they are. The Monster Killers also have that. The Wilder Corpse Hunters also have that. So it's really wonderful to see. And of course, the one mid-rangey guy in Royal Beast Flayers also has that. So a lot of their more recent bespoke offerings have had these interesting abilities, interesting play styles that are able to kind of elevate them out of this terrible mid-range trap that can happen. The one problem with Vulkyn Flameseekers is they've got pretty mediocre chaff. Scale breakers are not good. They're not terrible either, but they're not good. You're never going to be sort of dictating the flow of the game because you've got 3 scale breakers, something like that. So you'll run a couple maybe as filler, but even then they're not good filler because they're 95 points. The way I would run them personally, I have a few of them in gray. Here's my little egg whip guy. Oh no, egg whip guy who hasn't been painted yet. But how I plan to run them eventually is a Runefather, a Drothblood Thane, a Drothmaster, 2 Scale Breakers, a Decimator Prime, and an Annihilator Prime with Grand Hammer. What I'll probably do first, this is, I think, maybe a more powerful version than what I'm actually going to run first. I'm going to start with a Annihilator Prime with the shield, and then a Kurnoth Huntmaster with a sword. That's just so that I don't have to buy any more models. And if I like where it's going, I'll probably purchase a box of Decimators, because I just think Decimators are good anyway, and you can kit bash enough so that you can build a Protector Prime and a Decimator Prime and a Paladin with Star Soul Mace out of that box, which are, all 3 of those are incredible in Warcry. So it's a really nice pickup to get if you like having allies in your warbands just in general. But this is what I would do, because having those move 3 incredibly points efficient, terrifying Stormcast Paladin heroes is really powerful with Vulkyn Flameseekers, because their Egg Whipper can give them 2 free movement actions, which on a really fast fighter, like you could do this on an Achillean King and cover the entire board, for example, but you really don't need all that movement. You don't need to push something 20 inches around the board. Pushing something 6 inches is usually going to be just fine. But I think this is also why I liked Kurnoth, is being able to sort of move 8 inches is really nice. But in general, I think that this is higher leverage on like foot slogging, hyper efficient combat heroes than I think it is with sort of maybe less points efficient, really fast things that are getting into combat just fine on their own anyway. But we'll find out. I will be sort of testing this theory as soon as I can get my painting life in gear. Very excited for them, and they're a really great addition to the Year of the Dwarf. Last, I'd be remiss if I forgot about Chaos Dwarves. There are only 2, as far as I know. There's the Armator and the Spire Tyrants one. The Armator is better, so let's build with it. If we're doing Iron Golems where we're focusing on Armators, you can go with a Dominar. You still probably want 1 Ogre Breacher, and then I would have a Sloppity Bilepiper with 3 Armators, and then 1 Iron Legionary. The Armators are so cool because, once they're in combat, they're incredibly points efficient. They have 15 wounds instead of 12 for only 90 points, so they're really hard to clear. They do good damage. You want Sloppity to sort of get them into combat. And then Sloppity is also nice for that Ogre Breacher if it's in range, because now it gets move 4 and can get into combat a little easier. Finally, I'd spend the last points on either a Blood Reaver Chieftain, and then you'd have 15 points to put a blessing onto whichever deployment group needs it in any given game. Or you could do 130 points for a Poxbringer. So if you don't want to deal with thinking about blessings, Poxbringers are really good. They fit the Nurgle theme, so you could do Nurgle Iron Golems really well, and just have both, and that would be pretty powerful. I have sad Horns of Ashut noises written here because for some reason they didn't come with any dwarves. I don't know what they were thinking. They're also very, very good, but they don't count for this video because they're not part of the Year of the Dwarf. That's everything that I've got on dwarves for this year. It's been a wonderful year for them. Everyone playing dwarves has had a great time doing it, and it's just so nice, given how bad they were in Warcry for so long, to see them thrive all year. It warms my heart, and I hope that 2024 is close to being as good for them, though I don't think it will. I do think that we'll see some points adjustments, kind of bringing the dwarves down to size a little bit, but it's been wonderful while it lasted, and it's still working now. Even without Swift as the Wind, it's still pretty good now. So if you've got any dwarves sort of on your shelf gathering dust, take them out for one last spin before they get adjusted with any kind of upcoming points change. So I'll be throwing more videos for Warcry out in the future, but until then, may all your rolls be crits.